Hi again then guys, and welcome to the third installment of my online racing exploits in sport mode in Gran Turismo Sport, of course, and this series has proven to be pretty successful so far, pretty popular on the channel. Of course, originally I wasn't sure if it would be, but it seems that enough of you guys do enjoy these episodes. Also not just about racing, but also addressing some of the issues which many of you have discussed online, and of course now experiencing some of them myself firsthand, such as the penalty system, talking about the driver ratings, the possibility of sandbagging, various issues that you can actually have a good discussion about down in the comments. Now this time, I didn't have so much the issues with, driver ratings and penalties and stuff like that. The thing that was the main issue this time for me was my internet connection. Now currently my internet is very bad. They're trying to fix it. It's taken them way too long. I mean, what else is new? They always do. But it didn't stop me from actually being able to race, thankfully. I got kicked out of a ton of lobbies, which got very annoying. I tried to actually run in the Manufacturers' Cup, but I got kicked as soon as the race actually booted up, in effect, which was incredibly annoying, especially after qualifying and all that in the Beetle. But at the end of the day, it still allowed me to do these. Now, it's funny because these three races that I'm going to feature here, the highlights from, were actually very similar to the three events that I finished at Suzuka in the Group 3 Beetle. Because for those who didn't watch that previous episode, I've signed up with Volkswagen as my manufacturer of choice. I love their cars, not just in the game, but especially in real life. The Phaeton, the Touareg, there are tons of cars that they've made that I love. And in the game, I personally found the Beetle to be not necessarily the absolute fastest thing out there in Group 3, but just a very consistent car that suits me. And even the Scirocco, although traditionally I'm not as much of a front-wheel drive car fan, I just found that it was surprisingly quick. Kind of like the Megane as well, faster than it feels initially. And certainly doesn't seem as neutered as a lot of the exotics are in Group 4, that's for sure. And of course I've talked about that a number of times in my actual reviews of those cars. Now as far as how these races went down, it was funny because it was very similar to the Beetle. And I've had people constantly saying, oh, just wait, you're going to come up against awful people online. It's so easy to drop your driver rating with easy penalties and stupid people. And I don't doubt that. I know all of that is true. Of course, online lobbies in any racing game are always like that. You have a ton of idiots. But I've actually found my experience to be a very positive one overall so far in sport mode. Now, once again, for those who maybe are wondering, these are, yes indeed, chronologically right following on from what we discussed last time. So in the first video, of course, you saw my first race at Le Mans, which so far is kind of ironically the only race I've lost in sport mode. I've won every other race I've entered, including these. In the last video, I did the three events in the Beetle, fastest qualifier, clean race, held the pole for the entire event, didn't lose the lead once and won all of them. And then once again here, pretty much the exact same thing happened, except in the third race in particular, there was a bit of a change. The third race was definitely the best, and of course we'll get to that in due time. But as far as the highlights and some of my thoughts on this, because as the title and the thumbnail showed, these are actually my very first Group 4 events that I've ever done in sport mode. Of course, I've raced them in general lobbies, but again, never in sport mode specifically with balance of performance and all that kind of stuff. So what were my thoughts? Well, I expected it to actually be more of a challenge than it turned out to be. I thought that Group 4 would be much closer and much more competitive in kind of a, BTCC touring car style of way, or where cars tend to have 250, 300 horsepower. That kind of racing tends to be very competitive, whereas in GT3 and certainly up in prototype territory, you can often see one guy or one particular car that will just run away with the lead, whereas that doesn't seem to happen as often in these lower level machines. But it kind of did, and I was kind of the guy that it happened to, which is never a bad thing. But at the same time, I was expecting it to be much more of a close battle, especially given the run of very good events that I've had. I expected them to put me up against much faster people, especially now that I was, moving up in the rankings, S category sportsmanship rating, I guess, and a D category driver, which of course is still the lowest. As I said, these are chronological. You've seen every race I've done in sport mode so far, so I haven't done that many. But when we went into the first one, I started, of course, once again as a DS driver. I qualified first, as you could see, by about a second or so, or just under. I was the only Scirocco in the whole event. So once again, really noticing that people just don't have the love for Volkswagen out there. I'm sure there are plenty of people who do, of course, but I just don't see it in the lobbies that I'm in so far and in the sport mode events. most people tend to go for the very obvious choices of stuff like the Megane, and even in this first event there are a ton of Meganes in there, and it is interesting to see that the OP nature of stuff like the Scirocco and the Megane definitely comes to the forefront. And I've heard a lot of people say stuff like how the Scirocco in particular seems to eat through tyres more quickly than something like the Megane, and certainly quicker than an all-wheel drive car or a rear-wheel drive car will. And although that is accurate, of course it should burn through tyres quicker because of torque steer. Front-wheel drive cars just naturally do that, especially when they're powerful. But at the same time, it's not necessarily a bad payoff. For instance, with the Group 3 Beetle, the payoff that I often experienced, as many of you agreed with, was that it's more neutered on the straights. That's fine by me, because unless you're on a track where that really matters, like Le Mans for instance, the cornering more than makes up for it, and I will often choose a car that has better handling than speed anyway, because I find that that's more consistent for my driving style. So, as far as this event went, the Scirocco, much like the Megane, is just a very good all-rounder. Not quite the fastest thing through corners necessarily, because you can't give it the beans as much as like an all-wheel drive Veyron or a rear-wheel drive Corvette or something like that, but certainly very quick and very smooth as well. I found the Scirocco to be a very pleasant car to work with. I've definitely not done anywhere near the kind of mileage or time behind the wheel in a Scirocco as I have in the Beetle, but as far as the first event overall, it was very easy. I mean, I had my 5th pole, my 5th victory, and my 5th clean race to add to the existing run that I'd had. Of course, I'm trying to get those achievements as well, because they're all new to me, having not done much sport mode, and after a 1 second lead in qualifying, I ended up winning the race by 6.5 seconds, so it wasn't really much of a battle. I pulled ahead fairly quickly. You could see some of the internet issues, especially at the start where the cars were jumping around a bit, which is so annoying, but again, not much I can do about that at the moment. As far as the second event, once again I entered it as a D and S ranked driver, so again nothing had changed, of course. Again, as people told me, I haven't done enough races yet to jump up from D to C. And then again I qualified first, as you could see, this time though by a much closer margin. Although actually I'm saying that, it was only a second before, so I guess it's not that much closer, about 0.6 of a second instead of about a second. Once again, very good mix of cars on the grid, which is nice to see, but at the same time, not much in the way of Volkswagens, although funnily enough, this was the only event of the 3 where there was another Scirocco, so nice to see the love. The guy didn't do particularly well in that Scirocco, but still it's nice to see it on the grid, and this race was actually the one of the 3 that I won by the biggest margin, which was very interesting to me, and I noticed that the guy who was second for, as far as I noticed, pretty much the whole event, and I think he was in a Megane if I recall correctly, he did qualify, as I said, about half a second, 0.6 or so behind me. That's pretty good, that's pretty close, certainly capable of beating me, especially since my best qualifying times tend to be a good maybe half a second quicker than my average times are, in the race itself, generally speaking, unless I've got somebody really fast who's pushing me to be better, which of course happened with the Beetle last time. In this one, I just didn't find that that was the case. He dropped real fast. And although I didn't notice him ever lose second place, so he was consistent, but he was just consistently slower, and I ended up having the biggest winning victory of all 3, about 14.5 seconds over the course of the race. And of course, over only 4 laps of Brands Hatch, that's a pretty big distance, so maybe he did go off once or twice, but if you watch the time difference between us through the course of the event, it doesn't jump up at any particular time. I mean, I might edit the video, but in a literal sense, it wasn't like he made some crazy crash. I guess he's just not as consistent in the race, which is fair enough. A lot of people are like that. They can really pilot a car well when they're driving on their own, time attack style, but then when you put them under pressure with a whole lobby of people, maybe they don't perform as well. And of course, that's part of what makes an actual racing driver more competitive at what they do. Like the Nations Cup guys, for instance, they have to be able to cope under more pressure, not just be fast on their own. Whereas the way I am tends to be kind of the opposite of the guy who is in second. I tend to set a decent enough qualifying time, but then I'm actually faster in the race, such as with the Beetle. And of course, that's only when I'm being pushed to be by somebody who's good enough to potentially beat me, but I think I would rather be that way. I would rather be the kind of guy who is faster in the actual event than I am in qualifying, rather than being really good in qualifying and then finding that I'm in a lobby that I can't really keep up with, which is a major problem that I think a lot of people probably find themselves falling into. So keeping your consistency up is so so important, of course. And although I'm certainly not the fastest of drivers, I do try to be consistent. And generally speaking, I do tend to be. And sometimes that'll give you the win. And of course, that's something which I talk about a lot in my lap guide videos. Consistency is often the key, especially when it comes to endurance, because you can be the fastest guy out there over the course of one lap, but that doesn't matter over like a 24-hour race. You've got to be consistent, and even if you're slower, as long as you are consistent, that can sometimes make all the difference. So, as far as this second event, it was the only one of the three with a Scirocco. I had the biggest win, and again, I had another pole, another victory, and another clean event. Then that brings us to the third one. The third one was definitely the best event. Not quite as intense as the Beetle event from last time, but certainly very good. We had a guy behind me, I believe from the Netherlands, I think that flag is, and unless I'm wrong, but he was in a Cayman, which again seems to be a pretty popular choice of car, one of the relatively few Group 4 cars that is real, not some fictionalized creation. So he was in this car, qualified 0.3 behind me, so a really, really close margin. I still qualified first overall, but 0.3 is potentially a very good race. And this one is actually an event as well where I jumped up a rank. I was actually a C and S driver for the first time. So that was pretty cool as well, jumping up a rank instead of being constantly a D driver all the time. He was 0.3 behind me. I did still qualify first, as I said, and once again I was surprise, the only Scirocco in the race. This one is definitely the one of the three that I thought I would probably lose, because he was that close behind me. I don't know, I don't enter a race always assuming that I'm going to lose, but a part of me always kind of expects to, because I'm not as disappointed then if it does happen. But so far it hasn't. As I said, the only race I've lost was that very first one at Le Mans, and the reason why I lost, I would argue, is a mistake I made. Not because I wasn't the quickest, but because I pitted in when I didn't need to, which was a dumb mistake. But that's in the past. As far as this race went, it was close. Very close for a lot of the way through. It was fantastic. Multiple times I looked behind and he was right there. If I'd have made any significant mistake, he would have taken the lead. I might have been able to reclaim it because I did open up a gap between myself and him, but two very interesting things happened in the race, apart from me going up to a C rank, which was very nice. But also, I did have a 5-second victory, so of course, spoiler alert, I did win the race, but this was a race where he was very good, but then he made a mistake. And I didn't see what the mistake was that he did make, but around the 5-minute 15 mark, something happened where he must have hit something or gone off track, because within a very short time, like between 5:15 and about 5:40, he dropped like 3 or 4 positions, from being second and pretty close to way down. So that was unfortunate because he was having a very good race with me, and here's the interesting thing, if he hadn't have made that mistake, he may well have beaten me, because I made a rookie mistake at around the 5:42 mark, where I went straight off the track, not quite into the sand, thankfully, but onto the grass, and of course that ruined my clean race bonus, which was annoying. It's the first time since that first event that I haven't got a clean race bonus. But went straight off the track, and that time difference, if he hadn't made that mistake, who knows, he may have beaten me. I think I was still probably far enough ahead to win, but it certainly could have given him a chance to maybe make it very close, maybe neck and neck, maybe he could have overtaken, but it could have been cool. It was still a very good race while it lasted, especially between me and him. The next car, not so much. I did still have a 5-second victory, but overall, I had a lot of fun, considering that these were, as I said, my very first Group 4 events that I'd done. So now I've raced in Group 1 for my first race, then 3 races in Group 3, and now 3 races in Group 4. And that's my entire career online so far that you've seen. So, as I said before, I want to try for as long as possible to keep every episode of this series to be live, so that you follow my exact sport mode career, even the races that I don't win. It just so happens so far that I've had a very good streak of clean races, fastest qualifiers, poles and all that, and of course that's not down to me, that's down to the lobbies that the game keeps putting me in. So overall, that is it for this highlights installment. I found it very cool, and especially because Brands Hatch is far from being one of my favourite tracks. As I've said before, I'm not a huge fan of very short circuits like this one is, but it was still a lot of fun, and I think this track in particular is very well suited to, for instance, Group 4 cars. You know, big prototypes and Formula cars, they're okay here, but it's almost like it's too easy for those cars. It's more of a it's got more of a touring car vibe, I think, this particular track. So it was very fun, I enjoyed it, I liked representing Volkswagen again, even though of course I didn't have to, I just wanted to stick to it. And doubtless in future I will use some different cars as well, not just the same Beetle and Scirocco all the time. And even the first race of course was in a Hyundai anyway, because unfortunately we don't have a Group 1 Volkswagen, at least not until they add some kind of crazy GT1 style variant of the Nardo perhaps. Like that's going to happen. But overall, that's it for my experience this time in my first Group 4 events. Tell me about yours down below if you can still remember them maybe at this point, and also maybe general tips that you might have, maybe internet issues that you've been having as well. Obviously there's not much I can do to help you with that, but you could talk about it down below. And until next time, whenever that is, I'll see you then. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.